We're now joined by award-winning writer and human rights activist, Mama Elinor Sisulu, and Executive Director of Legal Investigations at Corruption Watch, Mr. Karam Singh. Thank you so much to you both for your time. I'll begin with you, Mama Elinor. I mean, when one listens to the political speeches that, of course, we hear all the time, we get a sense that corruption is a national emergency. But would you say that we take for granted that corruption really violates human rights?
Well, I think that people may not quite understand the connection between corruption and human rights. And corruption is an African problem. It's a global problem. There's corruption everywhere. But on our continent, our institutions are weaker. So corruption has a greater impact on us. And it definitely does have a major impact on human rights. Because for one thing, corruption is a stealer of jobs. We have a country where people or sections of our society at least have become very anti-migrant, especially anti-African migrant, what I would call Afrophobia, angry that African migrants are taking their jobs. And yet, if you looked at how much the corruption is the biggest stealer of jobs. Corruption, without a doubt, if you looked at the billions that have been stolen in corruption, those represent, tens of thousands of jobs, much more than any jobs that migrants are occupying. Corruption also results in mistreatment of people in institutions. When institutions are weakened, that involves it involves violations of the rights of people who are trying to do their jobs properly, such as the auditors or the investigators or the accountants. And we've seen very tragic cases of people being killed who are standing in the way of the corrupt. So it results in murder, it results in mayhem. So it is a crisis. And I think it's something which is a cross-border phenomenon. And I just think it's really important that South Africans locate themselves on this continent as part of this continent and learn the lessons, bad and good, from the rest of the continent. And certainly ways of dealing with corruption and the problems that corruption brings are one of those.
And I'll come back to that point that you make around dealing with this in just a moment. I'd like to move to you, Karam. I mean, one of the things that the World Bank says is that corruption erodes trust in government and also undermines the social contract. Now, to what extent would you say that both small and large-scale corruption have damaged the quality of public service in South Africa?
No, I think it's undeniable that corruption has had that impact, and it's had an impact at a systemic level, what you're talking about as grand corruption, and what we've seen through the testimony in front of the Zondo Commission in terms of state capture. So the repurposing of institutions of state, even state-owned enterprises, if you think we could call them publicly owned enterprises. These are entities which government has an interest in that are meant to assist in the provision of basic services and development to our society. So absolutely at that level. And then on the level of petty corruption, the kind of corruption that takes place every day, the corruption that takes place within schools, the corruption that takes place within the police or the interface with traffic officers. This is, again, it erodes the rule of law. And it does create challenges in terms of social compacting and in terms of citizen understanding what are the obligations of the state. When you're asked to pay a bribe by a traffic officer, and that happens again and again, that becomes normalized. And instead of the traffic officer exercising their mandate to promote safety and security on the roads, you now see it as some kind of a corrupt scheme that implicates normal people. So, when we talk about sort of how we begin to fight corruption, we talk about the need for a total society approach. So it's not just on government, but there are obligations upon the private sector, and there are obligations upon us as citizens and as active citizens to say no to corruption, to combat it, and to do what we can to be vigilant when it comes to promoting constitutional values and the rule of law.
And Mama Elinor, one of the biggest injustices, though, and violation of rights has got to be how disproportionately corruption impacts people that belong to, groups that are exposed to particular risks. I mean, you mentioned the migrants, but I'd also like us to zoom into the women. I mean, the president talking about how poverty continues to wear the face of a black woman in South Africa. That really is something that we cannot still be talking about, but much needs to be done around that.
Yes, well, if you did a study of gender-based violence as well, you'd find that corruption does play some role there. I mean, women complain about policemen being paid. I think just generally, everyone is affected by corruption, but of course, because of women's vulnerable situation in society, they would be more adversely impacted in some cases. And I would say that, when you look at migrants are very vulnerable. They themselves a lot of the migrancy into South Africa is a result of corruption in the countries where they come from, where industries have been destroyed, jobs have been destroyed, and they end up here. So, corruption is it's truly a cancer in our society. And yes, women are affected and children, because if institutions are not working properly, the services are not being delivered properly, I would say it's the poor that are affected most, because when institutions fail and when people are not held accountable, the people who can kind of survive in corruption and pay their way out are the ones who are more well off. For example, you'll find some services where people are charged, like for forms or to get in front of the queue. And it means that it's the people who have the money that can survive better than the people who don't. So the most materially deprived and marginalized people are disproportionately affected by corruption.
And Karam, the challenge, is corruption, of course. It is a big one. And the Constitution sets the bar very high here. But another challenge that we've seen over the years, which is a serious cause for concern, is the lack of accountability.
Absolutely. And I was listening quite intently with Father Michael Lapsley in your previous clip. We have a deep-seated accountability deficit in the country. I mean, if you think about the Sharpeville massacre, there was never accountability for that. If you think about the TRC process that we went through, there were so many people that never came before the TRC that didn't apply for amnesty, and we know that they weren't prosecuted, and we know that those prosecutions were suppressed in some cases. We had the Marikana massacre, and now we're dealing with hundreds, thousands, possibly, people implicated in state capture. We had the July unrest last year, where it was on the street looters who were prosecuted, but we haven't seen the kingpins of that who organized those protests being held accountable. So yeah, we have an absolute accountability deficit in the country. And if we think about fighting corruption, I mean, some of the pillars we talk about is around the promotion of good governance, around the promotion of transparency, but also realizing a rule of law society where there is real accountability, and particular accountability for those who've been implicated in corruption. And we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that for decades.
And Mama Elinor, when we talk about corruption, I mean, we always lament post the fact. We talk about how shocked we are that this has happened, how shocked we are that this money has been wasted, that this has happened and all of that. But one of the things that is going to be important as well is that we need stronger systems to prevent corruption from occurring in the first place. Would you say that as a country we are moving towards this direction?
I think Karam is probably in a better position to answer than I am. But I think that the Zondo Commission is a big step forward. And the question is, how far is it going to be possible to act on recommendations of the Commission and the findings of the Commission? And for me, that would be a litmus test as to whether we're moving forward or not. I wouldn't want to say we're moving forward and then nothing happens about the Zondo Commission. And I think there's been other commissions where not much has happened. So I think it's important that there is accountability, but, institutions need to be strengthened. And, in order, you have to be tough in order to deal with corruption. You have to have a whistleblowing, a strong protection for whistleblowers. You have to have all kinds of protection for the people that dare to put their necks out and to fight corruption. And also you have to have a strong political accountability. And I don't think that it's there. So I would hesitate. I would say cautiously, there have been some good steps forward, but just not enough.
And Karam, we're out of time. I'll give you 20 seconds. At the back of that, let's talk about the president today saying that people must come forward. They must report corruption because they see this at grassroots level. But what Mama Elinor is talking about is something critical. The protection of whistleblowers is still very critical. How do we strengthen this as a country in 20 seconds?
We absolutely have to shift our system. At the moment, we have a system around the protection of disclosures, protected disclosures, but we don't have a whistleblower protection system in the country. So we actually need a system which focuses in on protecting the individuals that come forth. And that protection is multiple. They need protection in terms of their safety, they need legal support, they need psychosocial support, and they need protection in terms of not being intimidated in terms of their jobs. So we need an absolute overhaul of the system which focuses on the protection of whistleblowers, and we also need a system which can incentivize whistleblowing. So whistleblowers should be able to gain some kind of reward in a context where their disclosures have led to recoveries of stolen money.
Okay, thank you so much to you both for your time. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much for those insights. That was award-winning writer and human rights activist Mama Elinor Sisulu and Executive Director of Legal Investigations at Corruption Watch, Mr. Karam Singh.